Hey everyone, and welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're going to impartially unpack the incredibly complex legal documents and AI-generated psychological analyses surrounding a really fascinating case, Dr. Jingyuan Chen. We are looking at a literal collision here. On one side, you've got a PhD scholar whose whole world revolves around nonlinear complex systems. And on the other side, a highly formal, rigid judicial institution. By sticking strictly to the source materials, the actual court verdicts, his appeal, and a deep dive psychological breakdown of both parties, we're going to see exactly what happens when a highly complex mind slams into a highly structured system. Honestly, if you've ever felt like a massive bureaucracy just couldn't wrap its head around your perspective, this case hits the nail on the head. It shows us the exact mechanics behind that total disconnect.
So, here's our roadmap for today. First, we'll hit the case facts, then get into the legal debate, look at the defendant psychology, examine the institutional psychology, and finally wrap up with complexity versus simplicity.
All right, let's just jump right in with Section 1, the case facts. Okay, let's trace the events to ground ourselves objectively. Picture this. From 2019 to 2022, Dr. Chen is just living his life as an independent scholar, and occasionally he retweets stuff on an overseas social media platform. And we're talking about a tiny account here, literally fewer than 100 followers. But then, in September 2022, he gets arrested by local authorities. By January 2023, there's a formal indictment for picking quarrels and provoking trouble. Fast forward to April, after a closed-door trial, he gets a sentence of 1 year and 8 months in prison. He files an appeal right away, but by May, it's completely rejected without even a hearing, and the original verdict stands. Which brings us right into Section 2, the legal debate. So in his appeal, Dr. Chen actually broke down the evidence against him into 4 specific buckets. He pointed out that he was sharing artistic cartoons, subjective emotional stuff, like a picture of a memorial candle, along with theoretical or political analyses from international figures and historical documents. His whole argument was that this kind of content, art, emotion, philosophy, doesn't have a simple binary true or false switch. Because of that, he argued, you just can't legally classify them as false rumors. And here is where the logic of the two sides totally splits. It's wild. The prosecution built their case on an assumption of intent. They basically said, look, this guy has a PhD, he's highly educated, so he absolutely must have known this info is false, and he purposely caused severe public disorder. But Dr. Chen's defense? He didn't just fire back with standard legal jargon, he used network physics. Think about how social media works for a second. He argued that as a peripheral node, meaning a tiny account with almost zero engagement, it was mathematically impossible for him to cause some massive avalanche of public disorder. He was demanding hard, empirical proof, not just assumptions about his intent. Okay, let's pivot to Section 3, the defendant's psychology. Let's look at what actually defines a complex mind. The psychological analysis profiles, Dr. Chen is having what's called a rational, independent personality. What does that actually mean for us? Well, it means he's driven from the inside out. He isn't out there fishing for likes, social conformity, or a gold star from the institution. Instead, he's motivated by his own internal compass for logical consistency and finding the truth. So when the system told him to just confess to knowingly spreading rumors, doing that would have completely violated who he is at his core. To him, the reality of the situation wasn't black and white at all. It was incredibly nuanced. A huge part of this is something called cognitive humility. You know, in science, especially when you're dealing with complex systems, absolute certainty is super rare. Dr. Chen doesn't look at a piece of information and say, yep, 100% true or 100% false. He sees it as a fluid, probabilistic process. So when the court demanded he call a post definitively false, his scientific skepticism just wouldn't let him do it. The analysis points out that what the court saw as defiance, or a bad attitude, was actually just the normal way a highly trained scientific mind deals with uncertainty. And we have to talk about how he handled the intense stress of confinement. Most of us would probably panic or just shut down entirely under that pressure. Not Dr. Chen. He used some incredibly mature psychological defense mechanisms. He used intellectualization, basically turning his own nightmare into a fascinating academic study. He used cognitive reappraisal to process it all logically, and meaning-making to elevate his defense into this grand philosophical stand. He even used humor. I mean, the guy literally sat in a detention center and drafted a highly academic, mathematically grounded defense. It is just mind-blowing how his brain adapted to that environment. All right, let's flip the script. Section 4, the institutional psychology. What is going on inside the system's head? The analysis brings up this concept of institutional anxiety. If you've ever tangled with a huge bureaucracy, you already know they absolutely hate uncertainty. The system's main job is to keep order, so it's hypervigilant about risks. When an institution is running on this kind of collective anxiety, its tolerance for ambiguity drops to practically zero. So when it sees something ambiguous, like an independent scholar quietly poking at controversial ideas on a tiny account, the system's anxiety magnifies that into a massive systemic threat that has to be neutralized immediately. And because the institution is constantly under pressure and juggling a million things, it leans heavily on heuristics. Think of them as mental shortcuts. The system doesn't have the time or bandwidth to sit down and debate postmodern art or network physics with every single defendant, right? So it uses a very rigid, binary sorting process. A subjective viewpoint, boom, it's a rumor. A simple retweet, that's malicious propagation. It is a machine built purely for speed and control, definitely not for deep, granular understanding. This over-reliance on shortcuts traps the institution in something called the fundamental attribution error. It's a classic psychological trap. The system sees an action, a retweet, and instantly assumes, oh, this person has malicious intent. It completely blanks on the situational context, which in this case was just an isolated academic geeking out over theoretical concepts. The analysis argues that the system misreads complex exploration as deliberate sabotage, simply because malice is a neat little checkback that the system's rulebook already knows exactly how to process. Which brings us to the big clash. Section 5, complexity versus simplicity. When you compare these two side by side, you realize this isn't just a legal fight, it's a massive psychological mismatch. Just look at how they process things. Dr. Chen is open and conceptual, the institution is closed and binary. Dr. Chen is totally fine with ambiguity. The institution absolutely demands certainty. His motivation is finding the truth, while the institution's is enforcing the rules. The source material basically argues that it's physically impossible for these two entities to communicate effectively. They are literally not speaking the same psychological language. It's a head-on collision between a person's need for complexity and a system's desperate need for certainty. Let me read you this quote from the analysis. Human brains are better at quickly judging who has a problem than accurately calculating if there is a real problem. That hits the nail on the head for this entire explainer. Our default institutional systems are essentially evolutionary survival tools. They prioritize sorting things quickly, avoiding risk, and maintaining control over getting things perfectly accurate. The system didn't stop to calculate if a guy with 100 followers was actually a threat. It just used a shortcut to quickly judge that he was the problem. This leads to a pretty powerful conclusion about this whole dynamic. It's called systemic projection. When an institution bumps into a complex person it just can't decode, someone talking about probabilities and cognitive humility, it copes by projecting its own rigid mindset onto them. Because the system itself operates on strict motives and rules, it simply assumes the defendant must be operating with some strict, hidden, malicious motive too. And that leaves us with this final, incredibly important question. Stripped of all the politics and just looking purely at the psychology and system dynamics, we have to ask ourselves, how are we designing the systems that govern our societies? As human knowledge keeps getting more complex and nonlinear, do our formal institutions actually have the capacity or the room to process the true nuance of human thought? It's definitely something to chew on. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and I'll catch you next time.